Jim Boykin, County Council.
Hi, Ariel Gerstein, Sustainability Manager for the county.
And Sally Brooks, the Zoning and Planning Zoning Administrator for Charleston County.
Hey, Scott Runyon, Dominion Energy.
Al James, PCD Code.
And Stuart Weinberg, I think I'm the sustainability person on this committee. I'm also serve as chair. Do you want to introduce yourself to ADA for us?
Hey, I'm Jen Jones. I'm the sustainability director at the Public Council.
We have complied with the Freedom of Information Act.
Yes.
Advertised.
Yeah, we're good.
I'll entertain a motion to approve the June 27th meeting minutes. Thank you. Second, right. All in favor?
Aye.
That's great. All right.
Okay.
That's you.
Yes. So I know we have resilience ordinance updates. I'm really not going to say anything other than I sent some attachments out from Karen via email. You guys can look at those at your own pace, and we'll be discussing them more at the December meeting. So plenty of time to kind of look over them, but we're not going to be discussing them today. We're going to take all of the time for climate action. So I'm going to turn it over to SSGR consultants online, but if you have any questions, feel free to just, interrupt and ask. This is supposed to be a discussion and not just talking at you. So I will turn it over to you guys.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us today. My name is Erica. I was not at the meeting last time. I'm a new face floating in your room today for you. And I'm here with my great colleagues, Camilla and Yule, who you will also remember from last time. They can introduce themselves in just a moment. So I'm supporting today. I'm the public engagement specialist. The project lead, Naomi, who you will remember from last time, wasn't able to join us today. So I'll be just sort of greasing the wheels and guiding this meeting along in our presentation, but you'll hear really from Camilla and Yule specifically. Do you want to introduce yourselves? I think we have some new folks too.
Sure. Hi, I am Camilla Melrose. I am a senior consultant with SSG, and I've been working on this project sort of behind the scenes, so I haven't been the public face of it. But as Erica said, Naomi couldn't make it today, so she's asked us to step in and lead you guys through this section.
And I'm Yule. I'm a principal with SSG and very pleased to be here.
Thank you both. Okay, let's move right into it and try to make a really valuable hour here for you all. So to quick look at our agenda today, we have first, I'm going to give a little bit of a summary of the feedback of some of the results from the first RSAC meeting. Camilla will then present low carbon assumptions, so including kind of what are the assumptions that are going into the greenhouse gas emission reduction modeling, how those assumptions are being determined. We'll also look at sort of the draft assumptions that will go forward into the actual modeling that will take place in the next step. Then we'll get some discussion and feedback on that. And then at the end of the meeting, we'll focus on target setting. So, just what are those objectives for greenhouse gas emission reductions? There's different types that can be used in different types of projects. So you'll provide an overview of those and look at what's recommended for Charleston. And of course, get your discussion and feedback on that. And then we'll do a closing at the end as well for overall feedback and some other kind of just comments in a Mentimeter to gather overall impressions from all of you. Yeah, if that's possible. We may have to do it old-fashioned, raising up the hand. We're so accustomed to online, but you're all together, so that's great. So we'll make that a bit more of a conversation. Okay, so part of the feedback that we heard from round two was that it has a really heavy emphasis on the technical process and that there was some interesting information, but also a bit hard to have input on some of those technical pieces. And then thirdly, that there were some folks that felt that they would have more more meaningful role when we start getting into talking about what are the actions for implementation. And that all makes perfect sense. And we wanted to provide a little bit of feedback on sort of that feeling and how that fits into the broader process. So this information is all going to be referenced once we get into that implementation planning. So it's important for you to all know where this is coming from when we get up to the point where there's assumptions that are being used as the premise for actions. And when we start to get into talking about details, it's really important for you all to know how we've gotten to that point. So we'll try to make it, and also we're getting closer to that point. So that area of conversation will begin in the next meeting. So please feel free to approach this with a learner mentality. We don't expect all of you to come in with sort of like a climate change analyst's mind on this. The main thing is to make sure that you understand where it's coming from, so that when we get into the next phase, you'll have trust in the process and understand, where these numbers are coming from, and be able to have a really well-informed, robust conversation about the implementation. So I hope that helps. Remember, any question at any time, interrupt us. We can see you. If you just put up your hand, I'll interrupt the the presenter for you, or whatever approach you want to. Just holler. They don't mind. And hopefully it provides some good insights. Great. I think that's all for me for introduction. Anything else you want to add, Ariel?
Nope, you're good. Thanks.
Yeah. So just a reminder on where we are in the process. So today we are just in between, we're in this kind of yellow highlighted area. We're starting to get into scenario modeling and are just preparing for that. And this kind of gives this presentation to you, helps us to move into that next step. Okay, get your thinking caps on. Camilla, you will. Any questions from you folks before we get into the material? Okay, let's do it.
Awesome. Okay, so I will apologize in advance. This is going to be fairly technical. So please shout out at me or raise your hand and flap or whatever to get me to slow down, to explain something again. And make sure that you feel like you're coming on this journey with us. I am going to try and make it as approachable as possible, but inevitably it's a complex model with complex elements, and sometimes it can get just a little bit overwhelming. So make sure you are asking any questions that are popping into your head. I welcome them. Okay. Erica can hit the next slide. Okay, so what we are working on right now is the low carbon scenario. And so up to this point, we have been working on establishing an understanding of how energy is being used in the county and where GHG emissions are coming from, associated with that energy use, and also from other sources. And so we've got a good sense of that in the present day. We are then projecting that out into the future to 2050. And so we have a good understanding of, if we don't do anything massive, this is what energy use and emissions are going to look like by 2050. So now we want to come up with a series of modeling actions that allow us to dramatically reduce those GHG emissions so that we can get to our target of 0 emissions by 2050. And then also that interim target, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So that really shapes the curve or the trajectory of how we reduce those emissions. So what we are building here today is the modeled actions. So they are the very technical actions that go into this comprehensive picture of what we need to do to dramatically reduce those emissions, as well as improving efficiency in energy use. So we build these actions through data and information. So we keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in other places. We make sure that we are getting the best information from within the county, within the state, at the federal level and beyond. And we are also working to establish those targets, as I mentioned, to help understand the shape of the curve of how we want to reduce the emissions. From there, we build some assumptions because inevitably the information that we get is for today or the near future. And so we have to make some assumptions about how that changes over the slightly longer time out to 2050. And then we project it for each of those elements, but within the model, we also build in some interactions within the actions. So it becomes this comprehensive projection out to 2050 of what emissions and energy use look like. Okay, so what makes a good modeling assumption? And this is really the big difference between what we put into the model and then what actually happens on the ground. And when we start to talk about implementation. So when we're talking about modeling assumptions, they are quantified, they're time restricted, they have to be an element that we track in the model, and they are very detailed. So just as two examples of what makes a good modeling assumption, we would say, for example, 4 megawatts of wind generation is being installed in 2035, and that is being used to directly replace grid electricity, for example. Another one would be 5% of residential buildings are retrofit annually to improve thermal efficiency by 50%, and that's starting in 2025. So it's a very specific thing. We're not talking about like the policies and the programs and the people that need to be involved in it. We're really just focusing on those like inputs into the modeling parameters. So the next discussion we'll have next time, and then probably, oh, I see a hand. Yes.
Okay, so under your good model assumptions, have you guys had any conversations with Dominion Electric to look at whether or not how they're getting their electricity, knowing that they are interested in moving into more of the using natural gas rather than coal? I mean, right now, we know that the electricity mix, I can only talk for the city of Charleston, not for the county, it's about 19% coal, and it should be going down because of the closing of the power plants in the next couple of years. So have you had conversation with Dominion? Because that really needs to be into your model assumptions, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. The electricity grid is such a fundamental piece of what we're modeling here. I would have to double check the source of it, but we do use a reference for how the emissions associated with grid electricity change over time. Normally I have Amber here who has them all queued up immediately, but if we get to the end of this, I can give you the reference for it. It might also be in the workbook as well.
I don't need the reference. I just want to make sure you guys are doing that piece. That's all. I don't need a reference. I just need to hear that you are speaking to. I mean, Dominion actually has some plans before the Public Service Commission, and having spoken to people from Dominion, I know that they're making some moves. So that just assure us that you're talking to Dominion, and actually it's Dominion and probably Berkeley Cooperative. Okay.
Yeah. So we've been working with all of the
Santee Cooper, sorry, also.
yeah, with all of
It's
the
just Berkeley and Dominion.
It's what?
It's just Berkeley and Dominion.
It's just Berkeley.
No, Santee's in our area as well.
Santee's generated, if you're worried about generation.
Yeah, I know, right?
It goes
Co-ops don't have.
Yeah, I know.
Central
They're
Cooperative, and then it goes from there to all the small.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have been working with those federally available sources, but if there are specific pieces that are firmed up that have maybe haven't made it into that process yet, we would love to know about it.
Okay, you could just check and have someone check with Dominion or Public Service Commission. All right.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks. Are there any other comments or questions about that part of things before I keep going? Okay, I don't see any hands, but again, just shout out at me if I miss your hand. Yeah.
So the mention down there is incentive programs for low income folks. What about for rentals and for landlords and apartment complexes and things of that nature?
Yes, 100%. That will be something that we talk about in implementation. So the second point from this is that right now we're just focusing on those modeling slides or modeling assumptions. And then in the next discussions that we have will be implementation, where we're talking about, for example, developing financing programs for low income. But yes, rentals and apartments are a huge part of that discussion, and they are a tricky part. So it is something that we'd like to include for sure. Yeah.
At the risk of being a little deep on that too, and I may be jumping the gun as well down the line on the 5% for the building retrofits. Have you modeled out, or does the model take into account what you mean by that in terms of the retrofitting to create the thermal efficiency of 50%?
We do have more specifics that go into it, and like the specific things that we would include in that type of modeling, particularly when we get into the finances. So costing out what it takes to actually do a retrofit to that level of like, is it replacing all the insulation and windows? Is it further than that? But we will get further into that when we talk about the building stuff. This one is just an example of the type of information that we're looking for at this level of the project.
Okay, thank you.
And to continue you consulting with groups, develop a financing program to allow low-income households to retrofit their homes. There is an existing program in North Charleston. You can actually get the name of the group to Ariel, and Ariel will give it to you. I think it's still in existence, but it's run by Muhammad. They've been there getting grants for years trying to help retrofit households in North Charleston.
Perfect. Yeah.
Right.
It's simple out there, metal cabinets, weatherization and so forth.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So again, something like that exists right now, and you should be tapping into that to see how that could be expanded for the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Where things are already working, we just want to expand it and build upon it for sure. Yeah. So great ideas. Keep them in place. We will dig more into them next time, but honestly, the implementation is the hardest discussion that we will have. So I'm glad they're already thinking about it, and send those resources to Ariel, and we will build upon them next time. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So you've probably seen this one before in the last session that Naomi did, but it's just to give a bit of an understanding of what it is that we are looking to build here today. And what elements are really important. So you can see at the top left, we are here today, and that's where our GHG emissions exist. This is just an example for a city. It is not Charleston, but it gives us a sense of like the moving pieces and what we need to care about. What you can see on the very top with the reference scenario is what happens if we don't make any big changes. And so that includes things like the change in climate. With a warming climate, we have more of a need for space cooling, but less of a need for space heating, population growth, development, all of that sort of thing. And then you can see each of the colored bands is one of those actions that works to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The very important part is the speckled gray area, which is our cumulative emissions over the time that we are working on this decarbonization pathway. And so there's a number of ways that we can get to zero by 2050, but ultimately from a global perspective, the faster that we can do this, the better. And the smaller that we can make that area of the gray speckled cumulative emissions, the better it is. So when we talk about our interim target a little later on, that's going to be the thrust of that discussion, is how quickly do we want to reduce the area under the curve? Okay, so what we have done here is pulled together some very drafty modeling assumptions for each of the elements that we are tracking in the model for Charleston County. And what I would love to get out of today is a discussion about how we can pull some levers harder. And also to give you a sense of, like, with this scale of change that we have drafted here, what the relative impacts are to that total picture of GHG emissions. And sometimes it can be a little bit shocking of how ambitious we need to be to achieve that net zero goal. And so it's okay if you have a little bit of sticker shock at some of the modeled assumptions and what that actually means for GHG emissions. Also, this is very much.
I'm gonna help you out. I don't think anybody in this room is gonna have sticker shocks. So
okay, great. Glad to hear it. Okay, get on board. We'll all be ambitious together. I like it. Also, these are very preliminary, so the whole point of them is to change them, but it's easier to edit something when you have it in front of you than to, like, picture it out of nothing. So with that in mind, this is what we have come up with our very, very initial draft of low carbon assumptions. And you can see that we are pretty far away from zero at 2050. So we need to pull a lot harder on pretty much all of the levers that we have available to us.
Oh, can you read some of the categories? Because on the screen, it's hard to see them.
We're going to go through each of them. So okay, I just want you to see the overall picture here. Don't worry too much about the categories. We're going to go through each of them together. The biggest one that you're seeing, which is the orange one right in the middle, is electrification of personal vehicles. And that one, and the rest of them are things like building efficiency, converting to heat pumps, that sort of thing. So with that, we will dig sector by sector into what these assumptions are and hopefully have a bit of a discussion about how we can go harder. Okay. So for demographics and development within the county, we hold these constant across all of our scenarios because the population is growing, climate is changing, people are going to need homes and businesses and everything else. So those are sort of the fundamentals that are baked into every scenario that we make. So we have population being modeled by BCD COG and employment associated with that. We have an increase in the required housing units over time. And again, we are seeing that we're expecting a warming climate with that increased cooling demand and decreased heating demand. And so that is the same across everything.
Do you remember offhand what the base year for the transportation model assumption is? Is it 2018?
I think it's 2020.
Yeah, it's 2020.
Yeah.
We don't have a 2020 base year model. That's
for transportation. Sorry, I thought you meant like.
So this is just my long way of saying we've got an updated model as of like a month ago.
Right.
If you wanted to dive into, we have updated numbers if you haven't already. Yeah.
I don't think we've gotten that. I can't promise. Yeah,
It's
if you can
model year for like the updated model year.
I think it's 2018. We wanted it to be pre-COVID to get rid of some of the noise in our population estimates. But that's something I can get to you if you want.
Yeah, okay. I will speak for Amber, who is our lead modeler, and say that we would like that. And we'll see how much work it is to swap that out.
I made a note of it, so I'll get back with her on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel. Okay, so we'll move on because these ones are not the super exciting ones. As you can see, population is growing, and then everything that sort of trickles out from population is also increasing, including number of personal vehicles, employment, and the number of households. So constant throughout all
these ones are exciting to me. So
that's fair. That's fair.
I just wanted to ask you a question. So there's an assumption here that household size is actually going to increase, at least over the next 10 years. That's something that I might question. It's mostly because your population estimate and your household unit estimate is coming from two different sources. So you might want to consider reconciling those two.
So this is the number of households, not the household size. So when we're thinking about
Yeah,
is
I'm
like the financial
doing a little bit of math between your population estimate and your number of households.
Yeah,
The ratio is changing over the next 10 years.
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just something to consider because at least as a national trend, we aren't seeing bigger households, we're seeing smaller households.
Has someone reconciled that already, or is it just because there's two different projections and most people live with that?
You're coming from population and household projections from two different sources.
Yeah.
So that's what you're showing on the previous slide.
Yeah, but no one within the county has reconciled those into something to address the point that you made. That
those projections are been independent today.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So we would have to tweak one of those two to solve that problem, which I guess we just have to make a decision as to which one we want to tweak. Because it's a good point, because we'll get less houses built as a result of that assumption than we perhaps would or should rather.
Do you have a suggestion as to which one would be better to tweak?
I'm not familiar with the household population
Okay.
projections, so I have to dig into them to get more info, but I can't.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it is a good point though.
We love it. I'm with you.
On a slide back or two, it's had the range, I think 29 to 36,000. I've seen projections that are significantly more than that. So
Yeah, can you go back a couple slides?
Yeah, that one.
Diamond, I think the most of the forecasting I see is 40,000 plus, not 29 to 36.
And that's what I'm getting to. Yeah.
Yeah, for Charleston County alone.
And do you know where, like, what source you've seen the higher number?
The CTAR, right?
Yeah, local rapid transit.
Through BCD call.
Because we're basing ours off our population estimate and assuming similar household size.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think to even list 29.
Well, one other point to bring up is
Okay.
those are vehicles, I'm assuming, associated with people that are living in Charleston County. If you add in all the folks that commute to Charleston County, I wonder how much higher those vehicles go up to. I know it's hard to
Yeah,
even imagine, but a ton
Yeah.
of people live in Dorchester, Berkeley, Holland,
Months
and
more.
commute here daily. And those are more vehicles, substantially more vehicles that would be by just folks that live in Charleston County.
So yeah, the employment estimate is going to capture income.
The commuters.
And Joe, Ariel included that because the Google data includes people coming in.
Well, yeah, for this model, we use the BCD cog transportation model. We
Okay.
didn't use the Google EIE data.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a good approach since we're incorporating.
That's right. Yeah, that makes sense.
But we can look into what you were saying, the low country rapid transit projections for the development, the housing unit development.
The other thing I'll add to that is not just the folks coming to work here, it's all our tourists as well. So I mean, we are a destination. So
Yeah, and I don't know, like, I guess I'm not that familiar, like, this would probably be an Amber question with the transportation model in terms of how, maybe, I don't know, like, how that's taken into account, I don't know. Tourists coming in.
Oh, it's not really.
Okay. It's just too difficult to,
No, it's not too difficult. We do include them coming from external stations. They're just not completely separated. It's a basic 4-7 model. So it misses a lot of things that a more sophisticated model would have.
okay. All right. I've
Are
gotten
we
these.
Move into more details about the buildings, do we think? And you'll follow up with us, Ariel, about the.
Yeah, I'll follow up about some of these different data sources we might want to use.
Awesome.
Great.
Okay. So
Ready for buildings?
I'm ready for buildings.
Okay. Everybody else ready for buildings? Okay, here you go.
Okay, so comparing the BAP, which is the business as planned scenario with the low carbon scenarios, we see that for new buildings, so for residential and for ICI buildings, we are improving the energy efficiency of them. So we have
Just explain what ICI is.
Sorry, industrial, commercial, and institutional buildings. And so that is everything from schools and hospitals and businesses, industrial buildings, all of that is encompassed within there. So it's sort of the like non-residential building world is in there. So by 2030, we are saying that all residential buildings will be net zero ready. And for ICI buildings, we are using the Charleston Rises building code. And then for existing buildings, we're saying that 100% of buildings are retrofit by 2050. And so they achieve a thermal standard of net zero ready and 30% electrical efficiency. And then coupled with these retrofits, we are also installing heat pumps for space heating and space cooling and solar PV generation where it's appropriate. And then within the actual city of Charleston, there is a separate action for removing 111,000 megatons of CO2 by 2025 associated with buildings. But when we look at the Charleston plan, there aren't a ton of details associated with how that actually works. And then, as I mentioned, for space heating and space cooling, as well as water heating, we are swapping out existing systems with electric heat pumps, and that's timed as we do retrofits or build new buildings. So, yeah.
Could you define net zero ready?
Yes, sorry. So net zero ready is a building standard of pretty high efficiency. I can't give you the specific numbers associated with it, but a net zero building is a building that produces all of the energy that it needs to operate over a year. And so it has a very tight building envelope, so it is highly efficient. And the net zero ready, as opposed to net zero, implies that it doesn't necessarily have that on-site generation associated with it, but it is still built to that standard of building efficiency.
You're using 2009 building code. Are you aware that there is very high discussion in our state legislature to have new building codes, right? I mean,
there's discussion. Is it like just give it up?
You don't think it is? Oh, okay. We're gonna stick with 2000.
They're separating the residential and commercial, right?
Okay.
That's what they're trying to do.
Okay.
But you don't think?
None of the residential stuff. Let's see, change that.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. But no. Clarify.
That's also for our reference scenario. So that's just what we're building off, which is sort of like the current day projected into the future. So it gives us a sense of where we're starting from.
Now, is density a lever that can be incorporated into the model?
Sorry, what was that?
The density of development, is that a lever that can be incorporated into the model?
It can be, yes. So it's an interesting one for us to build in. It has more of an impact when we talk about transportation than it does about necessarily like even building efficiency, because we are converting to electricity. We're moving away from more emissions heavy fuels. So there are a lot of reasons to promote densification, but when it comes to like specific emissions associated with a single residence or even a building, we don't see as high as an impact as we would anticipate. So when it comes to specifically the buildings themselves, we're not really considering densification, but when we talk about like the types of residential buildings that are being built, densification can fit in there and can also improve sort of like the efficiency per capita of like if you have a smaller home, you're going to use less energy per capita, that kind of thing.
So if we were to incorporate it, you think it would be better represented within the transportation section?
I think that's where we tend to see the impact more fully. And I see you have a thinking face on, but do you have anything? I know it's something we debate hotly, so.
Well, the other.
I guess. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say the other levers that it impacts are the size of the dwelling. So typically higher density implies more apartments or condominiums and duplexes and so on. So the average dwelling size usually goes down, which requires less energy, and you also get shared walls, which results in higher energy performance or an easier pathway to achieve higher energy performance. So those are two other elements that can result from increased density. And those, as Camilla pointed out, don't necessarily translate into emissions reductions directly if you've decarbonized your electricity system and you're using heat pumps because you're just still using clean electricity. But what they do is they make it easier to decarbonize the electricity system because you don't need as much renewables because you're using less, which means it's a lower cost and a lower burden on the electricity system. So density is like has a compounding effect on enabling and reducing the cost of decarbonization overall.
Yeah, so I'd make an argument for including it within the building section only because that's where implementation will come from. And just trying to be mindful of what we do with this plan later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any questions?
Quick question, and this is, it may be a little off topic, but it's kind of getting, yeah, what I'm kind of hearing is this is a total electricity based plan. Problem I would throw out there is we've got a huge natural gas network in this area of South Carolina, and those that aren't on natural gas are on propane. We get all dependent on an electrical grid that can fail. And I say that when we have hurricanes and winter storms, there's no backup here for all these homes. I mean, especially ones that are under live oak trees, there's no solar or anything else. How is that going to be factored into this plan? I mean, the people can't, a lot of them can't get along without any power at all. And sometimes it could be weeks, depending on the severity of the storm. And all these folks have got no power and no means to have power. And, if we're moving that way, it seems like, is there no place for natural gas and propane in this plan?
So, well, I can speak personally, as Camilla probably can too, but I have a solar and electrical backup system and have been through 2 hurricanes in the last 2 years and have been one of the few people who've had power in my neighborhood as a result. And those systems are becoming much, much more affordable. So I think there are pathways to ensure resilience against hurricanes with an electrically based system, and a lot of people are working on that. Natural gas and diesel have emissions, and if the goal is to phase out emissions, then there isn't really a lot of options. There are people who are trying to explore putting hydrogen in natural gas distribution systems as an alternative pathway, but that doesn't deal with cooling, which is a major issue, and the economics of that are still very much questionable, I think. And I don't think I think most people at this point think that heat pumps are the real pathway on the residential and commercial side. Certainly there's a role for hydrogen in the industrial and other sectors, but I think pretty much everyone is coalescing around electrification for heating and cooling in residential and commercial sectors, and for transportation, or personal transportation at least. There still are avenues being explored for other options for the natural gas system, but it's not clear that those are really viable as of yet. And we can incorporate that into a scenario, for example, to explore what that looks like. But it's pretty tricky.
We're going to have a hard time selling the public that they're going to be solely dependent on one power source, and having been through multiple hurricanes and been without power for extended time.
Yeah.
No air conditioning, no way to have hot water. I mean,
well, you don't have air conditioning with natural gas. That doesn't give you air conditioning. Well, and I think it's important.
You do. Most people down here have standby generators, and most of them
right.
If you propane or natural gas, because we are very vulnerable, and we may not get just one hurricane. We may get some subsequent hurricanes. We've had that, and we've been without power. The other issue is, we were very proud of our tree canopy we have here. We've got lots of grand trees. Many homes and lots don't have any place to put solar because they don't have the access to sunlight.
Yeah, which is
my home was not one that was, set up for solar power, because we've got grand live oaks all over our roof and everything else, and most of our yard. And I'm not trying. We're trying to do a one size fits all here, But that's why I want to make sure that we keep options open for those that this is not going to work for. But I agree, move towards as low emissions as possible. But when we go present this to the public, there are going to be a lot of homeowners in Charleston County who've been through a storm or two and a winter storm without power. And if they realize they have no other means to provide power, there's not going to be a lot of support. So I'm just saying, in this master plan, there may need to be some thought given into some alternative energy sources for folks so they're not stranded.
Well, the fun thing about electricity is it isn't a source of energy directly, it's an energy carrier. And so you can have multiple different types of inputs into an electrical system that really increase resilience. And I think what we have right now in most of the electrical systems across North America is a very fragile electrical distribution system that is very vulnerable to disruptions like you described. So really a critical part of this plan is actually increasing resilience of not just the electricity system, but the energy system. And those retrofits that you see before you on the screen right now, we have this thing called passive survivability, which is if you implement a weatherization agenda on a home, you're not only reducing its energy consumption, but you're actually increasing its ability to maintain comfort over a prolonged period with much less energy input. So, for example, if you hit to passive house standard, that house can maintain a comfortable temperature for 8 days without any energy input. So those are the kind of pieces that really increase resilience to extreme weather events and prevent deaths fundamentally. And in terms of backup generators, those are a critical part of resilience. So I don't think we would necessarily in any way try and phase those out. We might try and set up systems to switch some of those over to battery systems. And for protecting the trees are critical for cooling as well. So you don't want to do anything with those trees, but maybe you have solar gardens that are offsite, for example, or other ways or other electricity generation systems like deep geothermal or other options. So, but those are all deep, really important considerations to think through. But how do you make sure that people are safe when there's the main grid is not able to function for whatever reason, for whatever disruption? And resilience is a lens that we are applying in every element of our work for exactly the reasons you're talking about.
I have a suggestion, Joe, that maybe the beginning of our December 12th meeting, as a group, we have that discussion to give direction to them, right? Because some of us might agree with you and some of us might not agree with you. So I think it would be good for us to have some agreement among ourselves and present it to that group when we get together in December. So Ariel, could you just maybe
I'm making
slide
a
in
note.
10, 15 minutes?
And I appreciate you bringing it up.
I think it's really important. We had that conversation back when we did the city plan. So it'd be good as a group to have that conversation.
Well, and I think, the goal of this is, like, as you said, to get public support, to be able to bring it to council and get something that's gonna pass. So we want to keep all that in mind.
Dissipated as a.
Yeah.
Could you just clarify what? Oh, sorry.
I'm going to raise an additional concern related to natural gas and the notion that new construction is net zero ready, and I don't yet, and I'll excuse me if I'm ignorant and getting up to speed quickly here. Net zero ready, the definition of that versus net zero home, is there a difference there? But to assume that we can, from a policy perspective, enforce that by 2030 when we're sitting at 2023, I would need to understand from the home building industry side the implications from the policy aspect of saying that we're going to have all new residential construction at net zero ready by 2030. That would be a very bold policy declaration that I think would create significant public concern.
Yep, noted, totally.
So
just going back to the earlier.
I think I'd like to just intervene at this point because this is an amazing, fantastic conversation, and I'm sure Yul is giving you lots of interesting things to chew on. But we actually have a fair bit more of these sectors to cover. Like, we haven't talked about transportation at all yet. So I think just to try to make sure you have a taste of everything, we should move forward, and you all should keep having this conversation.
And I'm taking notes on everything you guys are saying.
We do have a time frame, so you're right. We got to move ahead. But what's
reality
really important is what you're hearing from this group is, as I said before, you don't have to worry about this group knowing what you're talking about for the most part. And our input is extremely important so that you don't go in one direction, and as a group, we're thinking in another direction. So that's important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we do hear you. I think it's what you're talking about, how, you know, how do we make this practical for people? If you want to reach this goal, what is actually going to need to happen? We're hearing that loud and clear, and hope that you also hear that there are solutions that can meet those concerns as you go into implementation at our next meeting.
Yeah, and also, so I'm hoping here just to like zip through what our base assumptions are, and then there is going to be opportunity for you to like submit your comments and thoughts, and you can also reach out to us directly as well. So it's not shutting down the discussion at this point. Means you can't bounce off each other as easily, but yeah. Okay, I think we can move on from this one because we've talked about this one. Yeah, let's start here. Okay, so there's a few different categories of how we are going to reduce emissions associated with transportation. The first is to reduce the number of trips that people are using their personal vehicles to complete. And the second is to reduce the emissions associated with those vehicles. So we are modeling that the Low County Rapid Transit is being implemented, and it will be open in 2028. We are also modeling that the transit buses are all going to be electrified by 2040. We are in the low carbon scenario, much more ambitious on the electrification of personal vehicles. We're saying that by 2030, 60% of new personal vehicles and commercial vehicles sold will be electric. And by 2050, all of the new vehicles will be electric. For commercial vehicles, for the light and medium duty vehicles, those follow the same trends as the personal. And then for heavy duty, we have 50% will be electric and 50% will be using hydrogen for those situations where we just can't complete what we need with electrification. The municipal fleet, to be a bit of a leader, they are also 100% electric by 2030, except for some of those heavy duty vehicles, which are 50% electric, 50% hydrogen. And if we flip to the next slide, we should be able to see the impacts of that. I think the previous one should be emissions. I don't know. One more. Yes, okay, so this is the emissions associated with transportation. You can see that we are decreasing our reliance on diesel and gasoline, but by 2050, there is still sort of residual reliance. That is because we are only saying new vehicles, and in the model, we have the ages of vehicles, and when they time out, they get replaced, but there are still some residual fossil fuel powered vehicles within the model. And then you can see that that fuel is being replaced by grid electricity. So based on this, I think there is room to improve two elements. The first is to be a little bit more proactive about how we replace existing vehicles and make the swap to electric vehicles or lower emission vehicles more quickly. And then that second element is, of course, the emissions that are associated with the production of electricity. So working to decarbonize the electricity grid is also an important part of reducing those emissions. If we flip to the next slide, we see the energy associated.
We got a question.
Yeah, just back to the assumption side.
Yeah.
So another component, in addition to implementation of the Low Country Rapid Transit System, is the expansion of routes and route frequency. So that's certainly within CARTA's fixed route plan. And that's something I need to point out in the second row, that it's 110 fixed route buses. We do have additional buses that are like paratransit cutaway vehicles that
it won't be EV.
Yeah, there's not a current plan for the electrification of those.
Right.
How many there?
And then our other kind of model levers that we can include in here, things like micromobility and parking. Okay.
I was just gonna comment, I think I commented this on at CCAP, but because we're aiming for a short-term reduction goal 2035 and not 2030, because that feels way too close and feels very stressful. Could we change some of that to 20, like these years that are on here?
Mm-hmm. For like the municipal fleet to change it to 2035?
Well, yeah, and the personal vehicles.
Do you even have the supply chain support a 60% conversion? I mean, 6% of the US population right now, or 6% is EV. You have 60% by 2030?
It's 60% of new.
I understand that.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting is that the tipping point from what they've seen throughout the world, which is not here, is 5%. So once we got past 5% in the United States, they think that's really going to be accelerated much quicker than we even imagined it being.
Well, that's fine. You can take an example like Norway, it's 85% of vehicles, but the government subsidizing the first 5 years of the cost of that vehicle to the entire citizenry. So sure, they're 85% conversion, but the government's paying the cost of that car for 5 years.
Good point.
So I agree with your models, but they're the assumption that there's a role there that is.
China's got the same kind of heavier government hand.
Right.
And that's how they're achieving those targets. But that is consistent with the federal estimate. So
Right.
it'd be
Okay.
hard to contradict.
Can I ask, I'm asking both you and you, is it helpful to break down this data into class and well, like income levels? Because like, is there, I'm assuming there's only a certain target population that will be able to afford electric vehicles.
Especially over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. But at least I would tell me if Camilla and you'll, at least for modeling, that level of detail is maybe a little too much for this exercise. But you're obviously getting it in the whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
No.
I mean, we're not doing an immediate swap out for fully electric, because the reality is it's going to take time for the market to change, and it's going to take time for even like secondhand EVs to trickle through. But we are seeing that shift is happening. Like even locally, there are companies that specialize in secondhand EVs that are making them affordable and sort of on the same price level as an equivalent gas-powered vehicle. So in terms of that like barrier to entry, I think as we see the market mature, it's going to come down more and more.
Just a quick one, and I go back, I don't want to get back on topic. It's like you go to the gas pump, you pump a car, you're gone, and they can turn over a ton of people conveying from one place to another. How in the world you got enough charging stations for everybody to pull up and wait for to charge their battery and continue on as we do now? I'm not saying it can't happen, but these are just practical questions I have as the country moves. That's all.
The guy with the horse then.
I don't know what technology, I know it's getting better, but I think it's got the fact that charging movement and transition, there may be obstacles in place that have not been achieved yet or overcome, that's all, that may impact how far out we go.
I think the way you discussed the behavior change. We are currently conceptualizing a world where we do the things we do now. And that's not possible. I mean, we all like buy into that. So what does it look like? What are the behavior changes that we're going to need to incentivize? How do we get there? How do we encourage people to buy in that's necessary? Because a lot of this is at home charging.
That only gets you so far. That's my point. You know, we travel in the end. I mean,
right.
We're a country on the move, and that's all. I'm listening. I'm just trying to understand all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And Kyle and I were just at an EV conference last week, and this kind of stuff came up all the time. I mean, I think there's different ideas people have of like you could, you know, a gas station could have batteries where you stop at a gas station, you get a, you know, you're changing out the battery instead of charging, or, you know, something like that.
But in terms of.
Not saying that's happening right now, but
In terms of immediate investment, Charleston County will need to provide matching funds to something like a charging fuel and infrastructure grant this winter. And to
Yes.
build out kind of the backbone of a charging network.
which we are working, we have an EV regional working group that Kyle is leading at the council.
Slightly possible.
Yes. Okay,
Sorry,
go ahead.
I think the relevant point here is let's envision a future and also think about the barriers to get to the future.
Yeah,
And not only that, but what's really important is this is the plan for now. We need to look at this plan every couple of years and
Yes.
modify it because, and make changes. So, I mean, someone tomorrow might invent the rapid charging thing, but right now, you're absolutely correct. We can't do what we'd like to go. So there has to be iterations along the way as we do this.
It helps point out where we need to put effort.
That's right.
towards making change.
okay, sorry, go ahead. No, we have 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
do you think we should go through this now, or should we spend a little bit of time talking about targets?
Talk about targets.
Yeah, do the target.
okay. Okay, I'll do that.
I just, if we're, just to try to get a little bit of both. Okay, let me flip ahead. So you nailed the round table. Okay, so you have received in your workbook, as well as like a link through the workbook, this discussion paper of targets, but Yule's going to speak to them for a little bit, give you a summary of what we're looking at with that.
Sure. So the question of targets has come up, I think, already in the conversation in different ways. And it is a thorny question because we clearly know what we need to do at a global level to reduce emissions to prevent 1.5 degrees of warming, around which there is global consensus. But how do we translate that target down to a municipality or a county, such as Charleston? So there are a few different approaches that can be used, and they represent different levels of ambition, and they're described within the briefing paper on targets. We've split out those different approaches into a science-based target using a carbon budget approach, which is really about cumulative emissions, target aligning with the US's federal target, which is not science-based. It's important to know that it represents a political paradigm rather than science. And then an evidence-based target, which is really developing scenarios, building them up like we have just been doing in this discussion, and then seeing where we get to, and that becomes the target. So those are kind of the four different paradigms. The science-based target, the first one, is really aligning with the global target for emissions reductions to align with 1.5 degrees. That has the weakness in that, theoretically, at least from an equity perspective, more wealthy areas, i.e. developed countries, should achieve emissions reductions more quickly. So it's not necessarily immediately obvious that what is the global target should be applied to a particular county. The science-based target using a carbon budget approach and fair share approach does include that equity perspective, whereas the US's federal target does not. And an evidence-based target is really sort of limited by our vision as to what the future or the current reality can transform, and doesn't really represent sort of we're constrained by our ability to see what the future looks like, essentially, which is exactly the conversation we've been having so far. So those are the four paradigms. Targets matter in that they send a signal to the community and businesses as to where the county wants to get to, and where it wants to position itself. But they are ultimately just a symbol, because really all the work is around the things that you guys have been discussing. How do you actually implement these emissions reductions as quickly as possible? I think the other important piece to note with targets is that we're no longer seeing GHG reductions as a sacrifice. We're seeing them as an opportunity, because increasingly emissions reductions are associated with increased efficiency and the energy transition, and much of the technologies are becoming cheaper than the incumbents. For example, with solar generation or batteries even, or electric vehicles, which are projected to reach price parity by 2027 now. So a lot of that is all about opportunity, and opportunities, economic development, and new jobs. And so that's kind of the paradigm that I think a lot of communities are working in. So it's no longer about giving up, it's really about embracing and making investments rather than paying for costs. So I think that where Charleston County wants to position itself in this target landscape is really the question that hopefully you guys can help plot the course forward. So that's a quick overview. Obviously, there are a lot more detail in the briefing paper on where these targets come from.
Does anyone have comments on targets? Can we do Mentimeter, I guess, on the phones? We don't
Has
have
everyone
to.
used Menti before?
Might be easier just to have a conversation.
Yeah, don't worry about that Menti
Yeah,
app.
let's just do it.
That's only good for yeah, like a big group and if we're in this situation. Do you have questions about the targets though for you before we?
From our discussion today, that it seems the direction we're heading was evidence-based targeting, just based off what we talked about. But is there any benefit to align, like when we're looking at electric vehicle funding, we're going to show the federal target because we're aligning for federal dollars.
Right.
So that has a narrow benefit to it.
Do we have a feel for what does the city plan take a certain approach that we should take into consideration?
The city plan uses the IPCC, I put that right, guidelines that we have a certain amount of reduction by 2030, instead of 56% by 2030.
Does it align with one of these approaches?
And probably
Science.
science-based.
Science one,
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something to consider.
The target is useful for the modeling in that we can see, well, here we model this scenario with all of these actions that we've identified with you and informed by others, and then we see we don't quite make it. So then we start tweaking actions to see, well, what can we speed up more quickly, or how can we adjust the energy system or the levers that shape the energy system to actually hit that target.
Would everyone agree that the science base would allow all those deviations, like for example, the concerns that have been expressed today in that model? Probably, right?
Not all of it.
Not all.
Probably with a combination of both the evidence base where we're at and the science base.
Yeah, probably right. Yeah.
Do we have combo options? Are we talking?
Yeah, you certainly do. You like one approach that can be really useful is you have a scenario, which is kind of your evidence base, and then you have your target, and there may be a gap. And it's okay to have a gap because you can continuously, as someone mentioned earlier, you can update the model and the policies in 2 or 3 years and try and figure out how you're going to deal with that gap. But it's perfectly, from my perspective, it's perfectly reasonable to have a gap between your target and the pathway that you're on, and realizing that you're going to try and find other levers that you can pull as you start implementing that pathway, which is really what a scenario is. Scenario is a pathway.
The natural gas example is an evidence-based, that's I think somewhat unique to us. I also think there's some market forces that are going to affect our ability to have the new residential construction, insulation, products, insurance limitations that are going to curtail our ability. So that combination of science and evidence-based is probably the right way to go.
Can we learn a little bit more about the fair share approach and how that would impact? I mean, can we at least do it, owe it a consideration?
The fair share approach is really tough because what it does is says that you have to do stuff proportionate to your kind of your economic ability. And when you start to apply that lens, you're into sort of 80% reductions by 2030 in emissions, which is it's possible if you decarbonize the electricity system really quickly, electrify everything really quickly. But the part where it gets tricky is actually turning over the vehicle fleet fast enough. So that's like, you can conceptually see how you can do the rest of the work, but turning the vehicle fleet over fast enough to hit 85% by 2030 is really challenging, at least from previous modeling exercises. I mean, all of it is incredibly challenging, but yeah. that way.
market.
Or a lot of those actual implementation programs are at the federal and state level.
Yeah.
So that's sort of not even an option.
It's an option.
Not a feasible one.
Well, feasible is also always an interesting question, because that's feasible is really, humans are really good at defining feasible according to what their circumstances are. So it's politically, it can be challenging. I mean, it depends on the context. You can start looking.
Okay, so we're
at the
about 5 minutes
economics.
over.
Yeah. Just as a note,
Sorry,
you can start. Okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just
Sorry.
gonna say, you can start looking at the economics of the different scenarios, and it's interesting to see how the deep emissions reductions ones are becoming much more compelling financially than the slower, less ambitious pathways. But that will come later. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, so now we're like 6 minutes over. I don't wanna, I'm sure other people have other meetings to get to. Are there any last comments? I mean, this will be a continuing discussion. Also, I know we've had like a really robust discussion today, which I appreciate. And we're not going, like the plan is not, we're meeting quarterly. I can hold a special meeting if you guys think it would be helpful to talk about this before December, because we are going to be getting into implementation at that point. So I don't want to miss any of your feedback, since it would be 3 months from now. And we have been discussing this internally, and you know, we have another working group that's not a formal committee, but I definitely want your feedback. You guys are experts. We have Dominion and the homeowners here, so you have a lot of great knowledge. Would you be interested in potentially trying to meet in October, November timeframe?
It's fine with me. Do you also want us to enter feedback through there?
Do you guys want them to?
Well, I was
can
gonna
ask.
say, yeah, we can put this link into your workbook, so you can do it now if you like, or like I said, it'll be in your workbook, so you can just go to the link there if you haven't read through the workbook yet, and you're able to find all this information there, as well as leave comments. It's just in a Google document, so everything's open for each other to view, and so if you have more feedback or want to emphasize any points today, you can do that right in there. So I'll put that link there.
And I'll send the link out via email.
So do you want a meeting, let's say in November after election day? You do that? What?
But okay, so what date, just since we're all here and be easier than doodle pulling all of you, what date would work?
Also, do we have a specific time frame for your timeline for doing the target setting and picking an approach?
Did you guys hear Kyle's question?
Yeah. So we're going to be revamping the low carbon modeling in the coming weeks, but there will be the opportunity to make minor tweaks to that if there's something that comes up after the fact. So it's not a done deal, but we are going to be modeling.
When do you need direction on the target setting approach?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say as soon as possible, but I know that you guys also have other things to do with your lives.
So also to clarify, you all don't have to come to a consensus or a decision on which target you want to use. We're collecting input from you and from the other advisory committee and from Ariel, and then we will be able to come to a clarity on what is the preferred. You don't need to go through a big, I just want to make sure that that's clear. You don't have to go through a large decision-making process with us. It looks, I think, based on this conversation and based on the other ones, my sense is that the majority of people are leaning towards a science-based approach. And then really with now like a coupling around evidence-based. So where are you really starting from and working toward? So I think you should keep providing input, but don't put pressure on yourselves. Like you all need to come to a consensus in the next week or so.
And I was thinking intermediate discussion would be more focused around what's in the low carbon modeling assumptions, since we had a lot of discussion of that, rather than the targets, sorry, I forgot my word, yes, the targets. So in terms of like what's going in the low carbon modeling assumption, what's the date on that?
Okay, so Amber and I are going to start working almost immediately on a revamped low carbon scenario. So we're going to pull harder on a number of levers. And then we can share the results of that and then have a secondary discussion around, if there's a remaining gap, what those assumptions look like, how we can pull harder to achieve that final goal. It will probably take us, I'm going to say 2 to 3 weeks to work through all of the modeling for it.
Right.
So that would align okay with the sort of time frame that you're looking at for like final comments on those assumptions.
Yeah, would mid-October work for people?
That's fine. I'm not here from the 11th to the 23rd.
What about, right when you get back?
Welcome back, you have stuff to do.
You're right. I'm doing a 13-hour flight.
Okay, what about the what about the 25th?
25th, good.
At the same time, does the 9:30 work for people? Make sure I'm
Yes.
available.
Right.
I'm unavailable at that time, but hold it back for me.
Sure.
I've got a board meeting.
Another time on that day?
No, I'm pretty booked on Wednesdays.
Okay, well, we can catch you up. All right, so I'll do October 25th. Unfortunately, sorry, because of the rules, we have to do this in person. So I will send out another intermediary meeting, and I guess it's like a special meeting, and
We've recorded it.
yeah, I'll record it. And I think technically, Stuart, you have to call for a special meeting.
Right.
Remember the rules correctly.
I'm calling for a special.
Okay. You want to vote on having a special
I
meeting?
moved to add a meeting on October 25th.
Okay.
All in favor?
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna stop this recording. Thanks, everyone.